Hi, welcome everybody. Fantastic to see so many of you. And I'm absolutely delighted that Professor Mann will be joining us. Professor Mann's obviously the author of a book we've been reading this month. Professor Mann is Distinguished Professor of Atmospheric Science at Penn State. He's also Director of the Penn State Earth System Science Center, and probably most known for the hockey stick graph, which in my mind, in my view, changed the global conversation on climate change by clearly communicating the link between CO2 levels and temperature to the public. So over to you, Professor Mann.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Paul, and thanks to all of you for reading the book. It's a real pleasure to have this opportunity to talk with you. I wanted to sort of reserve most of the time we have together for discussion, Q&A. In fact, that's what I assumed we were going to be doing, but I'm going to make happy to make some opening comments as well. You know, again, for those of you who have read the book, then you know that what it's really about is the challenge that we face today, now having largely gotten past sort of climate change denialism. It's just not credible for the forces of inaction that I call the inactivists, carbon polluters, and those promoting their agenda. It's just not credible for them to continue to deny that climate change is happening, because we're seeing the devastating consequences play out now in real time. So they've turned to these other tactics, this litany of words that begin with D, from denial to delay and deflection, and even doom and despair mongering, division. These are the tactics that are being used by polluters today. And the reason I wrote this book was to, try to alert folks to the obstacles that are still in our way, because, we feel like we're finally getting close to seeing meaningful climate action. And we can talk about, where we are today and the implications of the last conference of the parties, COP26, what it means, where we're headed. Happy to get in to any of that, but we're so close, and yet we still face these obstacles. So it's really important that we recognize them so that we can clear these obstacles and make the progress that we know we need to make in addressing the climate crisis. So I'll leave it with that, and happy to get into a discussion about really just about anything related to this topic, but certainly anything related to the book and the message of the book.
Fantastic, thank you. Does anybody want to kick off first with the first question? Raise your hand. I can see Paul Brown. Do you want to unmute and ask a question?
Good. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Mann, for writing your book. I think it's a very important one. I have a scientific question. That is, given the redistribution of weight caused by ice melting around the world, do you see the possibility that that is going to cause alterations in volcanic and seismic activity?
Thanks, Paul. Interesting question. There is some, there's some research that suggests that, the impact of changing ocean currents, ice mass, that changes in the climate can impact the behavior of the solid earth, the outgassing, for example, of through volcanic subsea volcanic events. It's sort of a controversial area of work. For example, there were a number of articles back in the 1980s arguing that El Nino events actually impacted volcanic outgassing through, again, changes in ocean currents, changes in ocean density that changes the pressure that is potentially felt, by the solid earth beneath the ocean. There's actually, I would argue, a more direct and conclusive and decisive impact that we definitely cannot ignore: the changing distribution of ice mass as the the Antarctic ice sheet begins to disintegrate, for example, and calve icebergs into the water. As we lose that ice in the southern hemisphere, that's changing the gravitational pull on the ocean surface. The ocean surface feels the gravitational pull of massive objects, and one of those massive objects is the Antarctic ice sheet. The Antarctic ice sheet, the gravitational pull from it actually pulls the ocean surface upward towards the Antarctic continent coastline, but it actually conversely keeps sea level lower in the northern hemisphere. And so one of the reasons we expect greater sea level rise in certain regions in the northern hemisphere, for example, and ocean currents and other things can influence the dynamic topography of the ocean. So sea level rise is part of why it's not globally uniform. It varies. But one of the reasons it varies is this gravitational tug from the ice sheets. And as we lose the Antarctic ice sheet, it's likely that sea level rise comes up even faster along, for example, the east coast of the United States. That's part of why that's a hot spot for sea level rise. And this is all relevant because some of you may have seen that there was just a report yesterday put out by NOAA here in the United States about our current state of understanding of sea level rise and how there's probably now about a foot of sea level rise that is baked in by mid-century, by 2050, along the US East Coast. That's baked in. We can't do anything about it. What we can do something about is making sure that we limit sea level rise to feet and not meters, where we would be headed if we failed to act meaningfully. Thanks again for the question.
Great. I can see Judy has a hand up in Swansea. Judy.
Hello.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes. Hi.
Hi. Thank you again. Thank you very much for your book. Very informative and very sort of big thump between the eyes for everybody. So great. I've got two questions actually. The first one is, how can you be so sure that the tipping points, for example, the methane, won't result in a tipping point? Because after all, methane is bubbling up from permafrost, and it will make a big impact. I know it's good news that most of it's coming from gas leaks that we are creating, so we can stop them. But even so, there's a lot of permafrost and a lot of methane in it. And the second question is entirely different. I think
I was going to suggest maybe we limit one question per person just so we can get more people in. So maybe which is your preferred question?
Well, the second one, actually.
Okay.
The second one. And that is, you lay the blame firmly on the fossil fuel industrial complex. And I would really like to know if you think that is it evil, really? Can one say evil? I don't like to believe people actually are that evil to care more about keeping their prestige and their money than about the whole population of nature and human beings on Earth. So what is motivating people?
Well, I'm not a psychologist. I should preface this by saying that I can't see into people's hearts. What we have to really take at face value are their actions, and fossil fuel interests undoubtedly have been lying. They've literally been burying their own research, research that their own scientists put forward decades ago, indicating the devastating, or to quote an ExxonMobil scientist, and this is from the book in 1982, catastrophic. Their scientists said the impacts of continued fossil fuel burning would have catastrophic consequences. And so how can you have your scientists telling you that this behavior is going to lead to catastrophic consequences for humanity and decide to bury that research and instead fund hundreds of millions of dollar campaign to discredit independent scientists finding the very same thing? Again, I can't see into people's hearts. Sometimes that can lead, for example, to cognitive dissonance, right? If there's a certain action that is going to be adverse to your own impacts, again, playing armchair psychologist here, there's sometimes a tendency for us to somehow contort our own thinking into denying, that the linkage. None of us likes to think. I like to think none of us wants to believe that we're behaving in a way that's evil, sort of as you're alluding
Well, that's
to
what
here.
I hope too.
But so sometimes we, there was a famous quote, I think I use it in the book, but I've certainly used it before, attributed to Upton Sinclair back, many decades ago. It's very difficult to get a man, it should be man and woman, but to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it. So I think sometimes there's this cognitive dissonance that arises from the fact that, climate action may hurt your own, personal interests. And so we don't have to ascribe evil to that. We could say people are misguided, or they're suffering from that sort of, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Mike, maybe if you go next, Mike Bagmary.
Yes, that is correct. Thanks, Paul. Yes, thanks, Professor. It was a fascinating book, and there are so many questions I'd like to ask, but I'll just go with the first among equals. I know you say you're not an economist in the book, but do you think, do you have any familiarity with the concepts of the social cost of carbon from your conversations with environmental economists? And do you have anything you'd like to say about that, such as whether you think it's too highly or narrowly defined?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And indeed, I'm not an economist, but I converse with economists, and I've co-authored some articles that sort of deal with the economics of climate impacts and mitigation. And so, yes, this is a concept that is very familiar to me and others who are in that space. And it can be a useful concept, but it can also be abused. There is a lot of, and this is always a problem, in the economics of these, when you look at the economic dimensions, for example, of something like, the climate crisis, so much depends on the assumptions that you make. And economists often start with pretty value-laden assumptions. And they will tell you that their conclusions are objective, but they're no more objective than the underlying assumptions. And this is a frequent criticism of some of the sort of climate economics work that was done by people like, Bill Nordhaus, who got the Nobel, Prize in economics for his work. But, people, Nordhaus and others who followed sort of with similar, lines of reasoning, make an assumption about social discounting, that you discount the future in the same way you would discount a 30-year treasury bond. But that sort of, then you're saying we discount the futures of our children and grandchildren. There's an ethical sort of, an implicit ethical component to that assumption. And the social cost of carbon, I mean, it's easy to bury in one number what we really mean by the total damages done by emitting carbon into the atmosphere. And sometimes it is defined extremely narrowly. If you define it narrowly enough and you discount the future, it's easy to come up with a scenario where, oh yeah, we shouldn't do anything about warming unless it exceeds 3 degrees Celsius, because we will have more technology in the future. We can solve this problem more easily. The impacts, we can adapt to them. There are all sorts of assumptions. You're discounting the future. You're discounting, future generations in doing so. Your estimate of the social cost of carbon is only as good as your total accounting of the damages. And there's so much that's missing in most of those assessments, particularly I would argue, based on some of the science that I've done, the impact that climate change is having on devastating extreme weather events, and the possibility of tipping point responses, like tipping points in the melting of the ice sheets. You can't rebuild the Antarctic ice sheet if you destroy it. No amount of money will allow you to do that and to bring sea level rise back down. To summarize my position as simply as possible, as I like to say, there is no economy on a dead planet. And so any analysis that tells you that, oh yeah, we don't need to decrease carbon emissions because we can just grow our way and find techno solutions to this problem down the road. The underlying assumption there is that somehow we can have an economy devoid of having a livable planet, and that just simply isn't true.
Great, thank you. Lisa Joak, apologies for my butchering of pronunciations.
That's fine, it's an obscure German last name. Thanks, Professor Mann, for being here today. My question is more on the kind of political side. If I talk about the climate with people, often there's agreement on the need for climate change, but once we start talking about the details, I feel like many people just don't think it's possible. I don't know if that's just a win of the doom and gloom brigade there. So I feel like sometimes there's a lack of knowledge on, for example, how many fossil fuel subsidies our governments really pay, for example. Do you think it's possible to communicate these more complicated facts in a simple way? Do you know any good examples maybe of success stories of doing that?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. It's a great question. And, I do. I think that we can. I think many climate communicators today have, really tried to expose the sort of absurdity of a system that incentivizes the very behaviors that are most damaging our planet, right? So we have, through these subsidies for the fossil fuel industry, both direct and indirect, we're providing, incentives to these sources of energy, energy producers that are destroying our climate. And what we should be doing, any sensible approach incorporates these so-called externalities. The damage done by emitting carbon has to be incorporated into the sort of cost-benefit analysis. So right now in the United States, we have all these subsidies for the fossil fuel industry around the world, hundreds of millions of dollars of subsidies for the fossil fuel industry. So we're putting our thumb on the wrong side of the scale. What we need to be doing is providing explicit incentives, subsidies, or negative incentives like carbon pricing to actually put our thumb on the right side of the scale so that we move the market in the direction it's already going. We're already seeing the decarbonization of the global energy market as renewable energy becomes cheaper, but it's not happening fast enough to avert catastrophic warming, 1.5 Celsius or more warming. So we need to accelerate that process. And the way we need to do that is by providing subsidies for renewable energy, taking away subsidies for fossil fuel energy, not allowing for new fossil fuel infrastructure. All of these things that, I talk about in the book, it's not rocket science. We know what we need to do to solve the problem. It isn't a lack of awareness of how to do it. It isn't a lack of technology. Right now, it's a lack of political will.
Thank you. Robert Gibson.
Yeah, thank you for writing the book.
Thank you.
So my question is regarding the Quiet Indian campaign. I'm wondering if you have any advice on avoiding the cultural challenging the cultural appropriation in the media or in this ad that the Quiet Indian ad.
Yeah, so the cultural appropriation of Native American sort of mythology and culture, and yeah, I mean, it was especially cynical. And, as I say in the book, even at the very surface, the campaign was cynical and involved subterfuge, because the actor playing this supposed Native American was an Italian American. So even that was a lie. But the lie went much deeper, right? Because it was all about exploiting, that sort of the mythology that was so powerful in the 1970s. I talk about sort of the zeitgeist of the time, and the way that there was, frankly, there were many efforts to appropriate sort of the cultural impact of Native American mythology for political purposes or economic purposes. And so it was especially cynical. It was appropriation, an inappropriate appropriation of Native American culture. It was, but more than that, it was being used to do the very opposite, right, of what, actually Native American culture does teach us, to value environmental sustainability. The values of Native American culture in the United States include sustainability, living sustainably on this planet. So it's just especially jarring that was used to actually help lead us astray and defeat efforts to pass policies to clean up, bottle and can litter by putting it all on us. And it's all too predictable that the fossil fuel industry would look at that and not say, "Oh, that's horrible what happened." To them, it's a playbook. It's a, hey, it's not an, it's not a cautionary tale. It's a how-to guide. That's the way the fossil fuel industry looked at it, and they appropriated that playbook for, again, to lead us astray on climate. Thanks for that question. It's important to understand the importance of the sort of cultural imagery that was used there.
Great, thank you. I'm quite conscious of your time, Michael.
Yeah, maybe two or three more questions. Yeah,
excellent. Megan.
Yes, hi. Dr. Mann, thank you for your book.
My daughter's also a Megan, so shout out.
It's a good name. So as a Penn State grad, I enjoyed reading a book from my alma mater.
Oh, thanks.
I was particularly interested in the sections on doomism, because I've certainly struggled with that in learning more about the climate crisis. And whenever I slip into that, I always try to stop myself and say, I wouldn't want Michael Mann to think I'm a doomer. But I think a lot of that feeling comes from a declining sense of agency, as you said in the book, in the political sphere in particular.
Yep.
With, the Build Back Better not getting passed and all of the gerrymandering and voter suppression.
Yeah,
it feels like we have less power as voters. And I was in the book, you seemed a little optimistic about tipping points in the political sphere. I was wondering, in the short time that's passed since the book was published, if you've had any changes in that thought, or if you're still optimistic about that political breakthrough, in climate action.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question, and in fact, in the paperback edition, which will be coming out in May, I sort of update things a bit. Where are we now? And there's no question that the fundamental threat we face in the United States right now with respect to preserving our democracy. If we don't have a functioning democracy, we can't solve any of these problems. And I'm as worried about that, I think, as you are, and many of us are. And so, yeah, I'm not sure I foresee how far deep into that valley that we would go. And, to the point where the Republican Party has labeled as, acceptable public discourse an assault on our Capitol in an attempt to overthrow a rightly determined election. So, yeah, I fear for all of that. I fear for the sort of the conservative, there's this conservative media bubble that so many have fallen into, and there is now this sort of coalition of malign media organizations like the Murdoch media, bad actors like the Koch brothers, and bad state actors like Russia, all seemingly in collaboration now to lead us down this path. And let's not forget that at the very core of it is a fossil fuel agenda. What's driving Russia right now is the fact that their greatest asset is their fossil fuels. It's their only major economic asset, and they are actively interfering with politics around the world to try to prevent meaningful climate action. So all of this stuff is inextricable. And yeah, I'm as worried as you are about it. I still try to maintain some optimism that, look, as things rebound, we're coming out of this pandemic now. The economic numbers are good. And if we get past the sort of inflationary pressures that have resulted from the sort of coming out of the pandemic, there is an alignment of sort of stars, if you will, where Democrats could potentially not only keep Congress, but maybe increase their numbers enough to get past this. Our obstacle right now, literally on Build Back Better, is 2 conservative Democrats who aren't playing well with the party. And so that's what it's about. It's come down to that slim a margin. And that can go either way. In the book, I sort of said, it's going to be on a knife edge, and we're going to need some sort of coalition between Democrats and maybe a small number of moderate Republicans to advance meaningful legislation. That's still sort of where we are now. And I haven't given up hope that it'll happen, but I, have as much anxiety as you do right now.
I certainly wish I was still in Pennsylvania to vote in a swing state.
Oh, yes, we could use you. Thanks.
I unfortunately moved to Maryland, more solid blue.
Yeah. Although your governor, you got a Republican governor, so.
Yeah, we're working on that one.
All around the world, we've got our fingers crossed for that. So, Herb, over to you.
Yes, it's really a delight and pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you, Dr. Mann.
Thank you.
I followed you on Twitter. In fact, I've actually had a couple of brief exchanges with you on Twitter. And I must say both were very positive.
Okay, thanks. I'm glad to
that's
hear
not
that.
always the case on Twitter. And
Twitter it can be a fraught environment, as we know, but that's good to hear.
I try to ration myself to 30 minutes a day, but I don't always succeed. I'm not a scientist, but I follow climate. I've written about climate for years. And I came across a study a couple of years ago that's been published that really concerns me. And I haven't been able to find a climate scientist to respond to it until hopefully right now.
Okay, let's do it.
It's called Radiative Heating of an Ice-Free Arctic Ocean by Pistone, Eisenman, and Ramanathan. And if I could,
Ramanathan. Yep.
Yes, sorry, I'll just read the last couple sentences of the abstract and get your response. So what he says is, here we use satellite observations to estimate the amount of solar energy that would be added in the worst case scenario of a complete disappearance of Arctic sea ice throughout the sunlit part of the year. Assuming constant cloudiness, we calculate a global radiative heating of 0.71 watts per square meter relative to the 1979 baseline state. This is equivalent to the effect of 1 trillion tons of CO2 emissions. These results suggest that the additional heating due to complete Arctic ice loss would hasten global warming by an estimated 25 years. And so I guess my question is there any research that shows how fast we have to reduce emissions to avoid that, what sounds like utterly existentially catastrophic results?
Yeah, so I would have to see that study to really try to appreciate the context, where they're coming from, because what you've just described is absolutely true, but it's entirely captured in the climate models that are used in the various IPCC assessments. We call it the ice albedo feedback. You warm up the Arctic, You melt the ice, so you've got a darker surface that absorbs more sunlight. That's one of the more important feedbacks. So it's not a forcing, it's not like adding CO2 to the atmosphere, because it's a response of the climate system that increases the warming. And you can use sort of similar metrics like, watts per meter squared to try to compare it to the watts per meter squared associated with CO2 forcing, but it's fundamentally different because it's part of the response. And it is included in climate models, the climate models that we use in these, IPCC assessments. So it isn't like they're describing something new that isn't, that's part of the projected future warming. And there are some uncertainties and sort of, I think, in the abstract you read, it sort of alludes to some of them. How do clouds change? Are there more or fewer? Are they high clouds or low clouds? Because those can have different radiative properties. There is a fair amount of uncertainty in the cloud, the response of clouds to the warming. And that's where much of the uncertainty today, if you look at the spread among climate models and how much warming we're likely to see in the future, that spread isn't coming from uncertainty in this ice albedo feedback. We've got that pinned pretty well, the loss of ice and how that increases the warming. But there is quite a bit of uncertainty in what happens to clouds. And at the upper end of that uncertainty range is, for example, a climate that has less low clouds. So you have even more solar heating and warming of the surface. So if you look at the spread among climate models, the models that warm the most are likely to be models that have the most positive cloud radiative feedback. And so that's really, if what I would be more worried about is the cloud part of that, not so much the ice melt, because that's pretty well captured in the climate models, and there isn't a whole lot of uncertainty or spread among the models on that. But clouds are a big uncertainty. And, that's why we have to think about the upper range of the uncertainties. We can't just plan based on the average or the low part of that distribution. We have to think about these, worst case scenarios.
Well, thank you. That I think that reassurance that at least the ice melting is already built into the models definitely lowers my blood pressure a little. So
okay, that's good. Well, that's good. The lower we can get our blood pressure, the more likely we are to survive on this planet. So that's good.
And maybe one final question, Sue Lyle.
Thank you. Responses from, I'm a member of Extinction Rebellion, and talking about the book I was reading, I've had responses of, oh, him, he's just far too optimistic. I can't listen to him. But I wanted to link that to the discussion we had last time in my breakout group around Catherine Hayler's book, Looking at Talking. And one of the members of our group said, I don't want to feel grief. I want to feel anger. I think anger is what's needed. And when I read your book, and particularly when I read about something I didn't know, the tobacco industry and flame retardants.
Oh, yeah.
It made me very, very angry, and that whole set of scenarios. And I thought, at the moment in the UK, people have stopped sort of loving Boris Johnson and have started to get rather angry, realizing that he's actually behaved very badly under the COVID conditions.
Yeah.
And I just wonder what you think about if people really understood that they've been lied to, deceived, and duped, and that they've been, hundreds of thousands of lives have probably been lost. I can remember crying as a young mother because I couldn't afford fire retardant mattress for my child. And I feel really angry at that. So my question really is, do you think when we raised anger, I raised it in another group, they said, no, anger always leads to violence. Anger is not the answer. So I just wonder what you think about trying to mobilize anger.
Thanks. That's a great question. And by the way, the whole flame retardant story, it's just remarkable. It's told really well in the movie Merchants of Doubt, which is loosely based on the book by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway. And I don't know if you guys do movie viewings as well as book readings, but you might consider actually, and just, if you haven't seen it, just consider watching the film, because it tells that story so effectively. And it does. I got very angry when I first heard that story. And there are some studies, interestingly enough, and like I said, I'm not a psychologist, but I try to stay up on sort of the latest research, the latest social science and psychological research when it comes to climate action. And there is work by people like Ed Maybach of George Mason University and Tony Lasarowitz of Yale. And if I'd stick it in the in the chat if I had it handy, but you can Google this and probably find these studies. They have done, focus group studies and polling, looking at what emotions seem to lead to the greatest engagement. And what they found is that, and it's very interesting because there's a fine line between what they call, what we might call sort of despair and doom, and worry. And it turns out worry is a positive emotion. You should be worried. You should have some anxiety. But if that veers into doom and despair, then it turns out that is a very negative emotion that leads to disengagement. And these are sort of aggregate trends. Not everybody behaves the same way. Some people might actually be motivated by despair. You can't say that everybody will follow the same sort of trajectory, but overall, doom and despair lead to disengagement. Worry can lead to engagement. And the emotion that had the greatest relationship with positive engagement was anger, was righteous anger. Is a very motivating emotion. And that's where we have to distinguish. And, I understand people who don't like anger and negative emotions, but righteous anger is something else. Indignance is something else. And I think the research suggests that can be very motivating. And I think that there's a fair amount of that in my experience in some of these movements, certainly the youth climate movement. I think Greta sometimes shows that righteous anger. And I think folks in Extinction Rebellion, that's a motivating force. And to your colleagues who say, that's a bad thing, we shouldn't be angry. The social science research actually says it can be really motivating.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Brilliant. I think that's a fantastic place to end. I mean, thank you so much.
Okay, but don't be angry, folks. Well, thanks. I was going to say that I'm happy to engage with folks. I'm on Twitter, Michael E. Mann at Twitter. So feel free to engage with me there, even though our time here is coming to a close.
Great. Thank you so much for your time. And we'll give Michael Mann a big round of applause.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everybody. Really enjoyed the conversation.